This week in Billionaires, streaming titan Netflix announced a deal to acquire Warner Bros. Film and TV studios and HBO from Warner Bros. Discovery for $83 billion, including debt. But 3 days later, Paramount Skydance, which had been angling to buy Warner Bros. For months, announced a hostile takeover bid, with an all-cash offer valuing the firm at $108 billion, including debt. The Paramount bid, led by Oracle billionaire Larry Ellison's son David and backed by the Saudi and Qatari sovereign wealth funds as well as Jared Kushner, would include taking over Warner Bros. TV networks, including CNN. Medical supplies giant Medline announced pricing for its hotly awaited IPO, which could value the firm as much as $55 billion. The Mills family, which founded the company in 1910 and ran it for generations, will retain an 18% stake after the listing, worth between $6 billion and $7 billion, based on an expected share price of $26 to $30 per share. In 2021, the family had sold a majority stake in Medline to private equity investors including Blackstone and Carlyle for roughly $30 billion. More Threads Technology, a Beijing-based firm that makes graphics processing units and is seen as China's answer to NVIDIA, went public on the Shanghai Stock Exchange. The firm's shares soared by more than 400% on its debut, minting 3 new billionaires. CEO and chairman Zhang Jianzhang is now worth an estimated $4.3 billion, while his fellow co-founders Wang Dong and Zhang Yubo are now worth $1.4 billion and $1.7 billion, respectively. Welcome to Beyond the Billions. I'm Giacomo Tognini, and joining me today is senior writer of Forbes, Richard Nieva. Rich, thanks so much for joining me today. You've been a reporter for more than a decade, covering tech and AI, and you've also covered Google for several years. So what are some of the biggest shifts that you've seen at the company over all of your years covering it?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I first started covering Google, and they were really expanding their mobile phones and Android business, their
Mm-hmm.
Android operating system. And then, a big shift after that was moving into the smart home, kind of the Alexa versus the Google Assistant. Um, and actually, I remember interviewing Sundar Pichai right when he first started as CEO, and they were releasing the Google Home, and it was the first time he had kind of declared that he wanted Google to be an AI first company.
Oh,
And that was in 2016, way long before ChatGPT. And you can kind of see, how prescient that was. Um, but I think hands down, the biggest shift for Google has been this generative AI focus. Um, and I think it's because that really kind of cuts to the core of their business. Google has been synonymous with search for so long,
mm-hmm.
and ChatGPT is really kind of the first big threat that's come to that in many years.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been following your coverage, over the last few years of Google and AI in general, and you know, this year Google, well, Alphabet, right, stock is up more than 60%, and Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the co-founders, have seen their net worths go crazy. But I want to take a step back a little, and you wrote this fantastic story in, I believe it was February 2023, about sort of how Google was actually losing the AI wars at the time, right? It was soon after the boom of ChatGPT. So could you unpack that a little bit and sort of where Google was at that point? You were just talking about how in 2016, Sundar Pichai had this idea about Google being an AI first company, and then fast forward to 2023 and it's lagging behind. So how did it get to that point, and sort of what was going on at that time?
Yeah, so I mean, they had started as a leader. Google kind of really took their lead from academia
Mm-hmm.
in their AI approach. Larry and Sergey were, famously Stanford grad students when they came up with Google. And so they started Google Brain in 2011, which is this research unit within the company that did a lot of academic work, did a lot of machine learning work. Um, and they made a lot of progress there. And in 2011, they bought DeepMind, which is
Mm-hmm.
this London-based AI lab that was doing really advanced research. They did this thing. They developed software that could beat a human being at the game Go. And so those two things really kind of formed their AI strategy, and they did a lot of really good things. They created the transformer, which was this thing that really enabled generative AI as we know it today. Um, the T in ChatGPT, it stands for transformer, and
Wow.
and so they created this thing, um, but they didn't really commercialize it. They weren't very aggressive. While OpenAI comes out with ChatGPT, it uh, you know captures the world's attention, and it sets off this AI boom, and Google was kind of caught flat-footed.
What exactly is the transformer? I guess in like a fifth grader's understanding of what it does. I don't know.
So it helps a lot with AI and prediction. So um, language models kind of uh, generate text as they go, and it
Hmm.
really helped models to be able to predict the next words in a way that was better than ever before. And so, you look at the generative um, AI boom right now, it's kind of all built on that concept.
And so, if Google was so early to it, um, what did you find in your reporting at the time that sort of led to Google squandering that lead and finding itself in sort of having to play catch up by 2023?
Yeah, I think Google was just kind of shackled by being the incumbent, by
Hmm.
being like the big lumbering tech giant. They couldn't move as fast as OpenAI. They couldn't, you know, they couldn't release a product like ChatGPT because they had too much to lose reputationally. You and I both know that AI hallucinates and makes things up.
Hmm.
Google releasing a product like that would have been really hard for them because of just the scrutiny that Google has on them.
Hmm.
I remember covering Google's big conference in 2021. They have a annual conference where they release all their big products.
Hmm.
They did this demo for this AI chatbot called Lambda, and it was a cute little demo. They had it so it was answering questions as if it were the planet Pluto, and it was kind of just that. It was a cute thing, and no one really thought anything more of it. But it was the exact same technology as ChatGPT, and it kind of encapsulated just how they were sitting on this technology but didn't really commercialize it, didn't really ship it. Um, and I think OpenAI just made them more aggressive because they had to be. They had to figure out how to catch up.
And so, how did Google then respond to that? I know that sort of Larry and Sergey came back right in 2023, and at least Sergey, I believe, sort of started coding again. How I guess how did Google Cinder Try? How did the team respond to that and try to catch up after that?
Yeah, so they did this big reshuffling. They streamlined shipping products so that they didn't have to go through as many checkpoints before release. As you mentioned, Sergey and Larry became more hands-on. Sergey in particular,
Hmm.
we had a script at the time that he filed his first request for coding in years. He and Larry had kind of stepped back from day-to-day operations from the company, but the AI race was so important that Sergey kind of stepped back in and got hands-on with the code, and it was code having to do with Lambda.
Hmm.
And the other big impact was uh, Google decided to merge Google Brain and DeepMind, which kind of allowed for the two teams to be more cohesive, more communicative, and to be able to ship products faster.
And so, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the next big milestone was sort of the release of Gemini, right? First, it was called Bard, and they renamed it Gemini. I think in late 23, early 24. How big of a moment was that, and sort of how did that release go for Google?
it was a big release, after ChatGPT came out. The big thing was, okay, what's Google going to do next? And
Hmm.
we had been hearing about this thing called Gemini for a long time. And they finally released it, and it was a good product. I think Gemini has always been regarded as a high quality model. And so, they've kind of been in a competition with OpenAI and Anthropic and the other big model maker since then. The different models are good at different things. Uh, Claude by Anthropic, for example, is better at code than the others.
Hmm.
They've all been kind of comparable to each other. Um, they made a really big step though recently with Gemini 3, which is kind of beat the others in some really important benchmarks, and so it's been getting a lot of attention there.
So I guess they've, I guess, fairly rapidly been able to scale up to matching the competition in these last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because of the changes that they made um, after becoming so scared by OpenAI. They declared a code red as a company, and
Hmm.
3 years later, I think we're just kind of starting to see the fruition of that.
And uh, another fascinating story that you've covered and I think are still covering is that unlike, we hear all the time about NVIDIA's chips and sort of how much of a bottleneck that is for a lot of LLMs and companies, right? That they need these ever more powerful chips that are really expensive. But Google actually has its own chips that it trains its model on called TPUs, right? Could you sort of talk a little bit more about that, how they're developed, how important that is to sort of Google's AI efforts?
Yeah, yeah. So they're TPUs. That stands for Tensor Processing Units, and it's actually something that's been around since 2015. So for a decade now, and they use them for lots of things at Google. To train their AI. They use them for driverless cars. They use them, for search ranking models and any AI that's in Gmail or Drive or any of their big products. Um, and it's been really advantageous, because it's this in-house resource that Google can just kind of pull from. Um, Sam Altman has kind of famously been out there making these multi-billion-dollar deals with cloud vendors, with chip vendors, and Google doesn't really have to do that because they have this thing that they make themselves, and so it's been really helpful for them in that way.
Is it cheaper for them, I guess, to develop it nowadays than it would to, like, has it been cost effective, I guess? Obviously, they're a massive company with tons of capital, but I guess financially, is it an advantage for them as well compared to having to go out and buy all these chips?
I think it's an advantage in the sense that, yeah, they don't have to um, they don't have to get all these expensive NVIDIA chips if they don't want to. Yeah, it's something that they can kind of easily draw from when they need to.
And so, it's kind of it's really interesting to see Google's story from those stories that you wrote in 2023 to now sort of reclaiming the mantle as one of the leaders in the AI race. And like I mentioned earlier, Google stock is up, more than 60% this year. Sergey Brin and Larry Page are now in the top five richest people in the world, which is a sort of milestone for them. What do you think has really been driving this, rising, the stock jump this year? How much of that is related to the AI, and sort of how do you see it progressing from now on out?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I mentioned, I think it's the fruition of the changes that they made 3 years ago. Um, and I think we kind of always expected that they would figure out at least one part of it, that they would make the changes. They've never been afraid of kind of making these big structural changes to kind of reinvigorate the company. The example I can think of is the shift to Alphabet in
Mm-hmm.
2015. They kind of overhauled the whole structure of the company. And so it does feel like they made a whole bunch of changes in 2022, 23, and now they're just kind of hitting their stride because of those changes.
So like after a couple, I guess maybe fallow is not the right term, but sort of less successful years, now they're finally reaping the benefits of those strategy shifts.
I think so. That's what it looks like.
Another sort of big change, I guess, at least as we think about it as reporters too, is when Google introduced AI search summaries last year, right? Um, how I guess how important has that been in Google's transformation and its changes in the AI space?
It's been big, it means that they can put their AI in front of people when they don't even realize that they're doing it. Google search is probably the most valuable piece of real estate on the internet. And anytime somebody does a Google search, they automatically, I think these days they get an AI response back. Um, and so it's been a big deal for them. They can kind of just like push it down our throats if even if we don't want it.
Right. I get like with the fact that Google is so ubiquitous, right? We all, for the most part, most people still use Google Chrome and Google Search. Do you think it was inevitable that with their size, they would eventually get things right and turn it around with these AI efforts? How much is sort of just their sheer size a factor in all this?
I think it's a big part of it. They're so well resourced, and you know they can kind of just throw money at projects. The big thing for them to figure out was just how to get out of their own way and how to kind of stop the bureaucracy from allowing them to ship products. Um, Again, we're seeing OpenAI just kind of having to make all these deals to get enough compute to keep going.
Hmm.
And with Google, that just hasn't been a problem. So I think, yeah, the fact that they are this huge company has been a really big help for them.
Well, speaking of throwing money at problems, right? They're one of these hyperscalers, along with Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, spending tens of billions of dollars on massive new data centers, right? How, I guess, how do their efforts in this differ from these other massive corporations, and how much are they spending on it right now? How do their efforts in the data center space compare to their rivals right now?
Yeah, it's a big investment for them, and it's a big emphasis for them. They're still lagging behind the competition, though. They're number three. Uh, AWS is number one, and Azure is number two,
Is
and
that in
so
terms
they're
of spending or sort of size of center? Like,
market
what's the
share,
metric?
market share.
Market share. Okay, got it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not a very mature business. I think they didn't start Google Cloud as we know it until really a couple of years ago. And so they've been able to grow, but they still haven't cracked, the top one and two spots.
So that's as far as the cloud computing, right? But then if we look at um, data centers for AI compute, right, where these firms are also spending billions of dollars, how is Google positioned there in terms of their outlay and sort of their developments in that space?
Yeah, so they're also really kind of expanding their investment. Sundar Pichai said recently that their capex for AI infrastructure in past years, maybe 4 years ago, was at maybe 30 or 40 billion. This year it'll be 90 billion. And so, yeah, it's a um, big expansion there.
And is sort of their the fact that they use their own TPUs and also like does that play a role into this at all? Like, does it cost them less money to build those out, or is it they're also spending money like everyone else?
Yeah, they're also spending money on everyone, but like everyone else. But I think the interesting thing with TPUs is that they are becoming more aggressive in using them in other data centers.
Hmm.
So they just did a deal with Facebook, where Facebook is going to be using TPUs in their data centers for AI as well. And so like that is an expansion in the chip business. That'll be really interesting to watch because they hadn't been as aggressive in that regard in the past.
So that's a sort of a new business line for them, right? That obviously doesn't exist for these other competitors, right?
Yeah, and it's becoming more and more. more and more meaningful. They don't break out the revenue from TPUs, but Morgan Stanley just recently estimated that by 2027, TPUs will bring in like $13 billion, which is, Nvidia's Nvidia's revenue for 2025 was like 130 billion, right? So it's nowhere near that, but it
Hmm.
is, it's a meaningful chunk of revenue. Uh, you know, these some of these other companies would love 13 billion in revenue.
Yeah, right. Especially OpenAI, I imagine. Um, I guess what are there's so many things to cover here. You cover AI and Google, and there's always things going on. And what are you sort of looking at the most going into next year? What do you think are the most important things to watch with Google's AI efforts and any new products they have down the line?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see how they can keep this momentum going. I think with the AI race, all of these companies kind of have moments where they're on top.
Hmm.
Um, and now it seems like Google has kind of pulled into the lead, and who knows how long that'll last. Um, the other interesting thing I'm looking at is DeepMind and AlphaFold, which is their software for predicting how proteins fold, which is really important to drug discovery.
Hmm.
And so, that would be interesting to see how they commercialize that. You know, partner with drug companies to see, to develop new products.
Yeah, that's amazing. And Rich, I always learn so much from reading your stories, and there'll be so much more to follow here. And I encourage everyone watching to read your stories and keep track of them in the new year too. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
You can find Rich's stories and the other stories we talked about in the show today in the show notes.